All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of Proof of Vision. Got a special episode for you today with a project that is not yet released called infiniFi. If you are, I guess, a yield farmer, this is an episode you want to listen to, especially if you're exposed to, Pendle, Athena, or you're lending your assets into money markets like Aave or Morpho or Euler. This is definitely an episode I think you should pay attention to if you're interested about ways you can maximize your yields, and obviously the risks that come with that. But we had Rob, he's the co-founder and CEO of infiniFi Labs, on to talk about how they've kind of automated the fractional reserve banking system, which is obviously a mouthful, and a very ambitious thing to bring to market. But we really got into what the risks are of the fractional reserve system in the TradFi world, and what they are in the DeFi world as well, and kind of tried to come to see what the vision is, for infiniFi and how it helps DeFi as a whole. So, hope you enjoyed the episode. Before you listen to it, full disclosure, I am a member of the infiniFi Labs team. So, obviously make your own assertions as to whether or not you think the protocol is interesting. And we will see you next time on the next episode of Proof of Vision. All right, take care. All right, welcome everybody back to another episode of Proof of Vision. Really excited to bring this one to you today. We've got a project that's recently come out of stealth, and hopefully we're going to be seeing soon, in the open market. We've got infiniFi Labs here. We've got Rob, the CEO and co-founder. Rob, how we doing, sir?
Doing fantastic today, Kirk. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I always like to start, for those that don't know, obviously I know a little bit about, what we're doing here, and what, a little bit about Rob, but
Just a little.
infiniFi is not your first project. Yeah, just a little bit. infiniFi is not your first project. So walk us through kind of your origin story into crypto, and talk about, how'd you get into crypto? What were you doing before this? And then what led to the creation of infiniFi?
I'll try not to go too far back, but I'm definitely going to. Yeah, so I got into crypto back in 2012 when I heard about Bitcoin the first time. I heard about it through, of all things, Minecraft. Was playing on some anarchy server, and someone mentioned this cool new thing called Bitcoin. Looked into it, was absolutely fascinated, knew it was going to take over the world. Bought a few, and wish I could say I still had them. Gox took most of it. The other one, fake ID. But I stuck with it. Stayed in the industry just as a bit of a hobby. And in 2021, I dropped out of my doctorate at Georgia Tech to go full-time into DeFi. I founded a small crypto startup that year. It's called Revest Finance. Launched in September 21, and found decent PMF, but not fantastic. And we kept building Revest over the next few years. As we built it, we just kept learning more and more about what people wanted. We realized pretty quickly they didn't want vesting NFTs. And so then we tried to play with rate swaps. And with rate swaps, we found something that people were quite interested in. That's what Pendle does, right? It's definitely something people like. But the way we designed Revest was that it used NFTs to, store the locked positions. And things like Pendle that used ERC20s were far more able to, well, I would say be composable. That's the right term. So we were constantly running into that problem of, hey, the position's locked. Well, why is it locked? We want it to be, at least somewhat liquid. And finally, in early 2024, I heard this from the guys at End of the Block. A potential client who we were chatting with was, hey, this is really interesting. We love what you guys are doing, but can you make it more liquid? We can't have anything that's illiquid on our books. And at this point, we realized, all right, you know what? Let's see if we can. Let's just go see if we can actually make it more liquid. And what happened was I started playing with Excel, a maturity tranche and a fractional reserve element. And at first it was just combining a few ideas that I'd seen done in other places, ideas that I'd, kind of had out of the blue. And suddenly everyone was making more money. I didn't understand why everyone was making more money, but everyone was making more money. And that was the light bulb moment. That was like, wait a second. This is just banking. This is just fractional reserve banking done in a decentralized and fully autonomous manner. And once I realized that, it was like, okay, this is way too big to fit under the umbrella of anything that I've done before. It's time to build something new. And infiniFi was born.
Awesome. Absolutely. One of the elements that it's funny that you mentioned as well, and like a lot of the founders that we have on this show kind of share these same traits. And the number one thing that I notice, right, is that, it's about the search for PMF, but it's like not being afraid to like iterate and like scrap something and pivot, if you need to pivot until you find that PMF. And it's just something that I noticed with a lot of founders in the space that, have had success or maybe like, have found very promising business models to be successful. So definitely, obviously an element that kind of stood out to me with your story as well. What are some of the things that you learned maybe from like, from Revest and Resonate that you've kind of taken into infiniFi, and kind of given you a leg up, when developing
It's
infiniFi?
the classic entrepreneur story. So, there's a famous story about Thomas Edison. And I mean, people bash him all the time, but he's actually one of my heroes. At least growing up, as a kid, I was like, wow, Thomas Edison, really cool guy.
Yeah.
You grow up, you find out he's a total asshole, but a lot of people are total assholes.
Like most of our heroes.
Honestly, everyone's complicated. There's no such thing as black and white, just shades of gray. So Edison, he has a very famous story about his first business. I don't remember even what it was, but I remember that basically what happened was he went out and he built something he thought would be cool, and it completely failed. And he resolved after that, to never build something that, there wasn't actual demand for. And I've known that story since I was like 8. And I thought, okay, of course I'm not going to make that. No. Every entrepreneur makes that mistake. I have yet to meet someone who has not built something they thought was cool and then had that, not be what people actually wanted, and then finally realized, oh, wait, I should be building what people actually are telling me that they want, not what I think is cool. So I think especially with Revest and Resonate, that was a mistake that I made. Particularly with Revest is I thought, yeah, NFTs, locked tokens, that sounds pretty cool. I found a lot of people who thought that sounded pretty cool too, which helped reinforce that. Unfortunately, the actual market that I've been targeting with that product, it wasn't as strong as I'd hoped. And what I learned from that is that when you are building one of these products, when you are doing something that, is new, you need to figure out, hey, is there actually demand for this? Do people actually have a problem that I am solving? And so with infiniFi was born solely out of trying to solve a problem for someone. It was, hey, can you make this more liquid? We would like to use this. We can't. We can't get access to Pendle. We can't get access to Resonate. We can't get access to these interesting duration assets because they are locked. Well, okay, now if they're not locked, suddenly we can get access. And that was the impetus behind infiniFi, was solving that problem for that group of people. Along the way, we actually ended up solving a bunch more, such as Pendle auto rollover. That's kind of a pretty esoteric one that we solve, but we do. We solve the alignment problem of banking. We solve, just the gap between what banks actually make and how much they pay their customers. We solve, really, what's the point of tokenization? And even more interestingly, we give people higher returns, which is a constant problem.
Right. And this is a perfect segue. Like, let's double click on like maybe each of those things, right? Or like, I guess let's talk to the users and tell them a little bit about like, what is the problem in your opinion with like the traditional banking model? And what does infiniFi introduce to this banking mix, right? That kind of improves the system and it creates like a new opportunity for users. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I found a really good image yesterday, and it's floating around in Lobsterdale somewhere. I'll go find it later. But it's basically a graph that shows, yeah, here it is, the total interest income and the deposit income. So basically how much are banks making on their investments, how much are they paying depositors. And you can put it up on screen. I'm sure you have the ability to do that in post. But what it shows is that over time, banks have been making more and more and more money, while depositors have been making less and less and less money from depositing in a bank. And well, that's because modern innovations have allowed banks to become more efficient, but banks are not incentivized in any way, shape, or form to pass that increased return on to their depositors. They just pocket it as profits. So, what do? We turn that on its head. We figured out how to automate a bank's core function, the asset liability matching problem, which is, you have a bunch of liquid depositors. How do you take their money and lend it out into a bunch of duration assets to make higher returns than liquid assets, while still making sure that these depositors can come and withdraw their money whenever they want? Normally, that's a pretty intensive process, involves a lot of labor, involves a lot of algorithms, involves a lot of people, but that's because they're using look-back models. We figured out that with the right systems, you could basically create a look-forward model by having people tell you what durations they want to be locked up for, using that to generalize what the population's desire is. And that automated asset liability matching engine that infiniFi has created on chain means that we don't need any of that overhead. And we also don't need to keep those profits for ourselves. We pass them directly on to the customer. So at its core, that is why we're able to give higher yields than anyone else in existence, because we are eliminating inefficiency while using time-tested fractional reserve principles that offer higher returns. At a slightly more granular level, we are also solving two subset problems of banking, one being the alignment problem and the other being bank runs. The alignment side, banks are actually fundamentally misaligned in their incentives. It's actually extremely perverse the way that incentives are designed in banking. If I'm a banker, I get paid a bonus, I get a promotion, I get everything I want out of life by making the bank more money. How do I make the bank more money? Well, typically higher returns correlate to higher risks. So, if I want to make the most possible money for my boss, I go out and I find the highest risk asset that I can legally put money into. And, well, sure, it probably isn't necessarily something I should be doing, but the laws haven't, been changed to make it illegal yet. So I'm going to go ahead and do it, and eventually the regulators can play catch up. What this ends up doing is creating a string of bank failures because these are perverse incentives. You can't really blame bankers themselves. If they don't do it, they're going to lose their jobs. It's just a really messed up system. So if you instead put the people whose money it is in charge of making the decisions, which is what we do, we put the long-term depositors, who are the first loss in our system, in charge of determining where capital will go. Well, that fundamentally realigns those incentives, and now those with the most to gain are also those with the most to lose.
Alchemix Finance empowers you to spend and save at the same time with a self-repaying, interest-free, non-liquidatable loan. Deposit your assets and access your future yield today. Available on Mainnet, Arbitrum, and Optimism. Head to alchemix.fi to get started.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And so, I guess just to talk a little bit about this, to give an example, right, of this problem, right? So I think what most recently probably Silicon Valley Bank, right, was an example of, they had over allocated to, long dated treasuries, I think was the problem, right? And then there was a run on the bank. And then there was a whole bailout and all these things. So like in the real world, the FDIC will bail out a bank that's in distress or that is maybe experiencing a bank run, or a larger bank will essentially purchase them, right? So how are you solving for this with infiniFi? And how does it make it maybe like a better model than that?
Yeah. So bank runs, that's the third problem. I like things in threes. It's actually an ancient Roman rhetorical technique called tricolon crescens. You knew I was going to sneak some Rome reference in there somewhere.
Yeah, there we go. We're getting our lore in. All right.
Anyways, I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation of that. Getting back to it, the way that infiniFi deals with bank runs is we approach them in a totally novel way. Banks can't do what we're doing because traditional markets aren't efficient enough for a bank to be able to have an efficient market on their deposit slips. But since we're on chain and AMMs exist on chain, we are able to set up an AMM for our deposit receipt token. That means, and what the clarified deposit receipt token is, when you deposit in infiniFi, you receive a dollar pegged asset, very similar to a stablecoin, called a deposit receipt token, IUSD. And if you stake it, it'll earn yield. If you lock it, it'll earn more yield. But what happens during a run is people come in and they redeem and they redeem and they redeem, and our liquid reserve is used to satisfy those redemptions. And eventually that reserve is depleted. Now, the system is still fully backed. All the money is there. It's not gone. It's just locked up in, Pendle PT assets or Athena SUSDE, which is a 1-week duration asset. So it'll be back in a few days. But in that interim, if you, as a depositor, still need liquidity, well, you can, instead of going and, have the government take over and bail you out, which is atrocious for society, you can instead go to Curve and sell your token on Curve. You can sell the IUSD for, say, 99 cents on the dollar if you really need to get out that badly. You'll take a slight loss, but hey, you've got your money back. You're happy. You've satisfied whatever immediate needs you had, and everything's good for you. Now, your loss, though, since you probably caused some slippage here, that's somebody else's gain. And that's where any arbitrageur who can price the value of all the assets backing IUSD can come in and say, hey, I know that I'm only going to have to wait 1 week. It's depegged by 1%. That's 52% APR. Of course I'm going to take that deal. We've basically taken the USDC depeg of 23 and turned it into a system where you actually know that all the assets are there, since they're all on chain and fully transparent, and you know when you're going to be getting cashed out. So, good arbitrage.
Right. Yeah. And so for users that aren't familiar, right, with that USDC depeg, right, which I think was the Silicon Valley Bank thing that was causing that as well, right?
It was the fallout. It was Signature.
Yeah, Signature. Okay, gotcha. So for people that don't know, right, Circle had some amount of their holdings that was backing USDC in one of these distressed banks. And so it kind of caused a little bit of a panic for a while on USDC, right? People were rushing out of USDC. It caused a depeg, on chain of USDC. But then an interesting thing happened, right? Is while other people were panicking, there was a ton of people that were buying USDC, right? At, I can't remember what it depegged to, 92, 93 cents or whatever it got to.
It got to 88.
Yeah, 88. See, yeah. See, so it's a serious depeg, right? And it's kind of a scary moment. But anybody that kind of knew or was able to, assess that risk, they were able to take advantage of that depeg and kind of profit from it when, I think it happened during a weekend, right? So it wasn't until Monday that, when the banks reopened, which is another benefit of being on chain and infiniFi, by the way, that people realized, okay, there's not really an existential risk here. USDC is going to be fine. They have very, very minimal exposure. And even if they do have an exposure, there's a way for them to claw that back. So now everybody's profiting off of this arbitrage. And I think, what you're saying, Rob, is that, if there is a bank run on IUSD, unlike the Silicon Valley Bank situation, people don't need to wait until the weekend to really understand where these assets are sitting and what the problem is. They can just look on chain. Right. So they're going to just be able to look on chain and see infiniFi's got X amount of $1 million in, I don't know, Pendle or Athena. So IUSD is still backed. It's just the liquid capital has not rolled over, into the redemption queue to redeem people. Precisely. Is that a good way to describe it?
That is exactly how it's working. And it's just like, hey, that money is going to be available in 5 days. And if you really need capital today, go swap out, get your USDC, off you go. But your loss is an arbitrageur's gain.
Right. Okay. So it makes sense from a business model standpoint, I guess from what problems are we solving, right? It makes perfect sense. Now let's talk about the actual assets, right? So you mentioned we have IUSD as kind of your deposit receipt token. Take us through the flow for a user. When infiniFi comes out to the market, what am I as a user doing? What assets can I bring to infiniFi? And what are my choices within infiniFi to earn yield?
Yeah. So when infiniFi launches, which will be quite soon, and you can cut this part out, but by the time it launches, by the time this video comes out, it may have already launched. Anyways, by the time it launches, you'll have several things you can do with the asset. And the first of those is staking. When you come to infiniFi and you deposit into it, well, you're getting automatically staked. That's how the main workflow works. Is you deposit to infiniFi, you get staked IUSD, and you start earning interest on that IUSD. That's very similar to SFrax ETH, Frax ETH dichotomy, or SUSDE, USDE dichotomy. And if you're in this side of things, you don't have to do really much of anything. You deposit USDC, that's the only asset you can deposit, but we'll have zaps available for Tether and other common stables. And yeah, off you go. Now, on the other side of things, where you're showing up and you want to get an even higher rate of return, because in SIUSD, you're already getting higher than you would in any other liquid asset on the market. Now, you can lock that SIUSD position into LIUSD, locked IUSD. And what that is you choose a 1 week to 13 week period. It's not every single week available, but most of them are available. I think like 6 of them. And based on how long you agree to be locked up for, from the time you ask for your money back, I will add, it's not 1 week from today. It's 1 week from when you say, I want my money back. So kind of a modified VE system in many ways. Based on the length of that period, that exit period that you choose, we're going to give you a higher rate of return the longer you agree to be locked in for, since you're taking on more risk by being locked in for longer. So that's really it. You show up to the system, you either take the liquid side or you take the lock side, and this is it. This is your journey. If you're on the lock side, you can vote. If you're on the liquid side, you can go, well, not vote, but you can do all the point system stuff, same as the lock side. You can LP across a variety of different venues. We're going to be having lending market integrations roll out. We're going to be having other derivatives off of these tokens roll out. I can't share those details just yet, but there will be other things to do with them. But within our actual ecosystem, it's very simple. Just taking USDC and getting into a position. We wanted the experience to be extremely straightforward.
Yep, and I know we touched on this at the beginning, right, about this whole concept of fractional reserve and like the rehypothecation. But so if I deposit my USDC and let's say that I just want to hold IUSD or staked IUSD on like the liquid deposit side of the system, what's happening after I deposit my USDC? Like what is happening to my assets that are actually going into the fractional reserve?
Yeah, so this is where the fractional reserve part comes in. What we're doing is you deposit USDC into our system, and we take that USDC and we deploy a fraction of it out to duration assets. So things like Pendle PTs, SUSDE, really any of the other duration assets in DeFi. And the remaining fraction, that's the fractional reserve part, that sits in liquid assets, things like Morpho, things like Aave, things like Gearbox, and it earns liquid yield there. But the other part of it is off earning a much higher rate of return in these higher yielding duration assets. We're informed what duration asset mixture we should be choosing, what our laddered portfolio should look like by these locked depositors, and what proportions of them are locking for 1 week versus what proportion of them are locking for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and so on. And basically their preferences inform us as to how that should look. Then they vote across, the different assets in those buckets and tell us what the exact composition should look like. So when your USDC comes in and gets deployed out, it's deployed across that entire stack proportional to how these deployments are supposed to be deployed. And Now you're making it a higher total return. Since your money is setting a sign that returns a higher rate, well, you're getting a decent cut of that money. Not all of the higher rate that your money is earning. We're giving some to the locked users because they're the ones taking the first loss risk, and they're the ones providing information about what durations we should be choosing. But you're making higher than you would make outside of our system, since your money is actually making a higher total return. And that's how it works. That's where this yield is coming from. There's no magic yield in here, no magic money. It's just like instead of putting $100 in something that earns 5%, we're putting $50 in something that earns 5% and $50 in something that earns 10%. And so the total return is higher.
No, it makes sense. And so like you almost have like two different user groups that you're appealing to with like, IUSD on one side and then locked IUSD on the other side. Let's talk about that for a second. Like, who do you think the ideal holders of staked IUSD are? And then like, who are the ideal people that you want to attract to locked IUSD? Like, who are these different user groups, I think, that you think infiniFi will serve?
Yeah. So I would say when we're talking about this dichotomy, I think it's one of the most common dichotomies in all of DeFi. That is the liquid locked dichotomy. I'm sorry, the active passive dichotomy. So you see this a lot with things like Morpho. You see this a lot with things like Gearbox. Really, any of the looping systems. There's a certain type of user who wants more interaction, who has a longer commitment, who is more interested in higher risk activities. And that's where I say the active side. That's that type of user. That's the guy who wants to go out and really just maximize his returns. For example, if he takes his locked IUSD, well, that's earning a higher rate of return than any of the Pendle PTs that are out there, since it's composed of them. He can take that off to Morpho, run a leveraged loop against that locked IUSD, and make the highest possible return anywhere. Now, on the passive side, on the positive side, these are the guys who are sitting in SUSDE. They're the guys who are sitting in Morpho. They're the guys who are sitting in Aave. They just want to deposit somewhere, know that their capital is safe, which they're getting from the first loss protections that we have. And then they also just don't want to have to think about it. They want to set it, forget it, and reap the benefits. They don't love using things like the active side of Morpho or actively participating in Pendle PT purchases because they forget to roll over their positions. So they're going to love what we have on offer since they can get those higher yields and never have to worry about rolling over their positions. It's the same reason that they like, the passive side of Morpho. If somebody else goes out and does a ton of legwork, you sit there, passively earn yields, don't have to think about it.
Right. No, it makes sense. So basically, so typically users that would they just want to lend their capital into money markets. They want to put their capital into a yield bearing stable. Like that's like IUSD or staked IUSD, right? And then on the lock side, you're looking at more, people that already have risk exposure to Pendle PTs. Or Athena has like the 7-day withdrawal period, for example. So it's more people that have like a duration preference already would be attracted to the lock side, and then people that maybe don't would be attracted to staked IUSD. And the beautiful part about this product, I think, is that you've got a product that can speak to both sides of the spectrum, and really serve both of those user groups. And we've seen that do well, right? I think for other products that kind of have, the same kind of dichotomy, right? Like, we mentioned Athena. You mentioned Pendle even, right? If you want to be a passive earner on Pendle, you can. If you want to take a more active, like degen role on Pendle, you can, with the YTs or with the PT looping. So it's these kind of products that I think have historically done very well. So that's something that I think stands out about infiniFi as well, right? Now, obviously, higher yields are not without. Typically, they have their own risks, right? So higher yield usually comes with higher risk. You talked about it a little bit, but let's get into specifically each side of the system now. So, like locked IUSD, what are the risks that users need to be aware of? And then staked IUSD, what are the risks that users need to be aware of?
Yeah. So on the locked side of the system, what you're running there is you are the first loss capital. So in the event of, say, an exploit in Pendle, or an exploit in Athena, or an exploit in Well, Ave's got the
Yeah.
best lending in the entire system, so that's almost kind of a
Hopefully not.
joke.
Please no. Please God.
Yeah, no, that would be very bad. Exploit and Morpho, I don't know, just really anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, you're the person who's going to absorb it. Before anyone in the entire liquid tranche takes a cent of loss, you're going to lose your entire shirt. So it's higher risk in that sense. If you're already okay with these assets, you probably are fully aware that in the event of an exploit, you're probably going to lose your entire shirt anyways. So really depends on how you're looking at the risk. But you're concentrating your losses being in the duration side of infiniFi. That all said, you are getting a higher rate of return than you would in the naked asset. So whether you think that trade-off is worth it or not, that's up to you. Personally, I plan to full send most of my capital that's sitting in PTs into infiniFi as soon as I can. Now, on the liquid side, your risk is, again, I mean, you are taking on some exposure risk to all the other protocols infiniFi is deployed across, that counterparty side. You are protected actually more in infiniFi than you are even in something like Aave, since Aave doesn't have a first loss tranche. Here, there's a bunch of people who will lose their shirts before you take a cent of loss.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. No, right? It's kind of counterintuitive, but technically this is actually slightly less risky.
Right.
Now,
Right.
granted, the counterparty risk may outweigh that, but it does have that going for it. What you're getting here is you're getting a higher rate of return. You are getting the ability to access these duration returns that you otherwise wouldn't be able to access. But your downside, of course, and your primary risk on this side of the equation is you have bank run risk. So in the event that everybody starts trying to exit all at once, you might not be able to immediately redeem. You might have to exit via an AMM if you really, really need the capital today. Typically, we expect these things to last for maybe a week or two, just because of how we see assets typically skewing shorter term versus longer term. Could be longer, could be up to 12 weeks, I believe is our maximum duration. That to me is very unlikely, but I cannot say that it is impossible because it is not impossible. So on that side of the system, you really have to balance, hey, am I going to need this money? And if you are going to need that money, you should make sure that you keep an eye on the reserve's health so that in the event of one of these events, you can be first out the door.
Gotcha. And then talking a little bit more, like, so that's the risks. We talked about the rewards, obviously, for the holders and the participants within infiniFi. Like, what are the benefits for DeFi that infiniFi you think presents? Like, what are the benefits for protocols? How does this, I guess, further the vision of decentralized finance, in your opinion?
Well, I think that the long-term implications here are staggering. In the short term, if you're a protocol and you're already able to make X% return for your users, if you send them our way, we'll make them an even higher rate of return. If you're a duration protocol, we'll increase your TVL in this activity, since you probably have plenty of users who have capital set aside in these liquid assets because they only want so much duration exposure. Introduce them to us, we can help onboard the rest of that capital into you. Not all of it, but at least a fractional reserve of it. So that's the benefit to protocols, is deepening TVL, increasing the amount of capital deployed to these duration assets, increasing returns to their users at the native level. The benefit to the users, of course, is higher yields. You're getting a better rate of return than you otherwise would. I suppose the protocols who we're deploying into, it's also that, hey, that capital is sticky. It's in there for however long we said it is. It's not going anywhere. I know from experience that having guaranteed capital is a very useful thing. And a lot of protocols do want that. The long-term benefit, though, is much larger than any of this stuff. The long-term benefit is, since we can increase returns on any asset, we can increase returns on TradFi assets. And DeFi's lack of an edge right now, the reason that DeFi has not taken over and completely dominated TradFi out of existence is we don't have an edge over them. We have higher efficiency, sure, but higher efficiency, that's an economy of scale benefit. It doesn't work for the medium and small players. It only works for the massive ones. So what do we need? We need a genuine 0-to-1 innovation. We need something that actually tips the scale completely and says, oh, I'm going to get a better rate of return if I tokenize my bonds and run them through infiniFi than if I just hold them off chain in the ancient custodian that they're sitting in right now. And we create that. We give people a reason to care about tokenization in the first place. Since if you have a bond doing 10% off chain, you bring it on chain, run it through infiniFi, I can make that bond do 10% more. So you're now making 11% versus that original 10. And to DeFi people, that may know, that doesn't sound that exciting. To TradFi people, that's a lot. That's an insanely high improvement. And that is enough to make them completely reconsider their entire structure. That is enough to make them give DeFi a second look, because finally it has something that they can't get off chain, which is a higher rate of return on assets that they already own. So in the short term, infiniFi is going to just give you better rates on everything that you're already using. And so we expect to see a lot of inbound from most of DeFi, just because, everyone in this industry is rate maximizers. It's super predatory. It's super, not predatory. Vulture starts with an M. Has to do with armies. What's that term?
Why can't I think of this?
Private army.
I need to get out the dictionary myself.
I always have one of these. Anyways, yeah, capital in DeFi is very, very interested in higher yields, and we'll be able to give them those higher yields. So short term, we grow DeFi's existing size into slightly bigger size, better returns. Long term, we bring in the rest of the financial world, because we've got what they want, which is a better rate of return without significantly increased risk. Higher risk adjusted return is what they're after. Higher risk adjusted return is what we're selling.
Gotcha. So in the short term, obviously infiniFi is built on DeFi. I think we're building on DeFi first, right? You're coming to market on DeFi yields, but you see infiniFi moving into TradFi yields as well, and maybe helping some of these tokenizers really like hit the inflection point on and convincing people to, bring their assets on chain and giving them a financial reason to do that, right? So it's almost like infiniFi is a bet on DeFi expanding and yields expanding on chain. But once you hit that RWA angle, right, you hit that RWA liquidity, then it becomes a little bit less of a contingency on DeFi, right? And then it can kind of tap into both.
DeFi is only the beginning. I mean, rates on chain going up definitely helps us. We don't need rates on chain to go up, to be honest, since we already drive them up. It certainly isn't as exciting for me to say to you, hey, you're getting 6% right now on Morph. I'll give you 7.5%. That's not as exciting as saying, hey, you're getting 7% on Aave right now. I'll give you 12.5%. And those are the numbers that infiniFi was doing back in the 24 hype cycle there. But 6 to 7.5 is still pretty good. That's a 33% improvement. So certainly yields going up makes it look sexier, but all the same, even in the worst conditions, we're still doing better than everybody else out there. So yes, we start in DeFi, but DeFi is not the final goal. Eating TradFi and consuming the banks is the final goal. Putting DeFi on top of the financial pyramid where it belongs is the final goal.
This episode is brought to you by Pendle. Pendle is a leading protocol in the DeFi yield sector, operating as a permissionless yield trading protocol, facilitating the tokenization and splitting of any yield-bearing assets in DeFi. This allows users to speculate on future yield or earn a fixed rate on their assets. Learn more at pendle.finance.
it's an ambitious one, right? And I think one that hey, if we're not here to do that, then what are we doing here, right? So it's good to see more products. I think and there's other examples coming out like etherfi, for example, with their debit card that they just released, but more financial products that are aimed at like making an improved version of what exists in TradFi. Like those are the kinds of things I think that we need to focus on more
We
to
need
bring
new
more people on
ideas in
chain.
this space. You got to believe in
Yeah.
something.
Right. No, absolutely. So we talked about, earlier you mentioned, I think that like the locked IUSD users have the voting power. What are they voting on exactly? Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So they're voting on the exact, well, I say exact. It's hardly exact since we have to perform a bunch of off-chain calculations and rectifications on these votes to make sure that they respect the caps that are set on the farms. But they are voting on the milieu of what both the locked assets and the liquid assets is going to be. So what percentage of money is going to go to, SUSDE 528 versus what percentage of money is going to go to USDE 730? Or, how much are we allocating to Morpho versus how much are we allocating to Aave? What Morpho vaults are getting allocation? Well, I shouldn't say that. They're not voting on the actual assets that are listed. We do the curation ourselves, at least at the start, because you can't have somebody voting $100 million to Joe's shitcoin. That's not okay.
Yeah, I don't think we'd like that.
Yeah. So we have this setup where we're doing the curation of what assets are acceptable in concert with several private fund partners and experienced diligence. I say diligence partners. I guess I don't want to say the word partners twice, but that's accurate. Anyways, so we do that, and then we present a list of those assets, and the duration users vote on what they think the exact makeup should be. Of course, you're only able to vote on assets that are either equal to or less than the duration that you yourself are locked for. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. You shouldn't have a 1 week person voting for a 7-week asset. That's nonsensical.
Gotcha. Okay. So essentially, if I want to be able to be in like maximum control as much as I possibly can, then I want to be locked up the longest so that way I can vote on all of the durations. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be accurate. If you want to vote on everything, max lock.
Right. Right. And you said max lock at launch is going to be 13 weeks, right? So we're talking in the grand scheme of things, right? Like if you think about duration, and I know crypto, like people are okay with like 4-year locks, historically, with something like VECRV and stuff like that. But we're talking about relatively short duration, in the grand scheme of things. Like, do you ever see infiniFi expanding beyond into like more duration, or like why have you guys chosen 13 weeks as the max, or like such short durations are the max?
I mean, it's really a combination of two things. One, the yield curve is extremely flat. Even after just 4 weeks, it starts to flatten out. And that's crypto. Not quite sure why. Our research has told us it's pretty flat. Sometimes it even starts to go negative after about 13 weeks. As in, it goes up a little and then it starts going back down. And this industry does not like super long dated assets. It does not ascribe them a premium. It finds them distasteful because it's such a short attention span industry that moves so quickly. I would say the other thing is there's just not that many of those assets. It's a bit of a feedback cycle. Those assets don't perform that well, so nobody issues those assets. And with a general lack of assets, well, there's no reason to issue those longer dated periods. As we see more of those assets show up, which I do think we will as the industry matures more, then we'll start to expand out our durations. But we're mostly reacting to what the market is telling us rather than trying to tell the market it needs to act a certain way. I don't think, and in fact, I've learned from experience that trying to tell the market how it should feel never works.
No, it makes sense. I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? Why you created infiniFi and why you shifted to infiniFi. You've got to meet your users where they're at now, and not the other way around, right? So you can actually serve them and convert users and give them something useful. So I think that makes sense. And on the yield curve thing too, I think that also makes sense to me, because if anybody looks at Pendle, you'll see that like you can, on a 4-week PT, for example, or a shorter dated PT, you earn a certain percentage, and then you look at like a 3-month PT, and like the delta between those two things is not really that large, right? So like, why would you allocate to a 3-month PT when like the 1-month PT is paying you relatively the same amount, right? And so I think you do see that playing out on Pendle quite a bit if you're paying attention. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just no real depth beyond that point. You can actually look at the liquidity on these things, and you see the liquidity really starts to build up as they start to approach that 12, 13-week mark from any further out. And it gets even deeper as they get closer and closer. This is partially because, the older PTs roll off and the newer ones roll on, and people move their liquidity from the old to the new. There are probably more market dynamics to this than I fully understand, but based on my observations, I'm just going to listen to what the market's telling me. What the market's telling me, nobody wants assets longer than a quarter. A quarter in this sector is basically 30 years in the real world. Let's just be honest here.
No, exactly. I was just going to say that. Like it's like a lifetime. Okay, cool. Well, the last thing I wanted to cover then, right? So, all the voting power is with the depositors, right? So, I always ask everybody that comes on the podcast, like, if you guys are planning to have a token, then what does that token do? Like, what is the utility for that token? Usually it's governance. With a lot of the other projects, obviously, that come up, it's governance, but it sounds like governance is segregated from the token. So, are you guys planning on launching a token, if you can say that? And if so, like, what do you think that the use of that token would be?
So we are. The token, well, I'm not going to say what it's targeted for. That would be very stupid of me to do. And my head of marketing would be quite upset with me if I said that. But I'll say, yeah, so the token, the way we see it, it probably will have some small governance component, but the main use of the token is actually utility. I was really impressed by how Pendle structured their token. For those of you who don't know, the way the VE Pendle system works is you, as an LP on Pendle, you get a higher rate of return the more VE Pendle you hold, which drives this wonderful feedback cycle where you want to go out and buy more VE Pendle if somebody else is buying more VE Pendle, so that you keep getting the return you're already getting. That is incentive alignment. That is a positive feedback cycle into their token. And that is why when they grow larger, utilization of that token goes up too. It's really good flywheel. So I want to basically take that, absorb that, and use a very similar system, except I don't have LPs that I'm worried about, in as much as I have actual yield generation. So the way I'm foreseeing the infiniFi token is you take that, either lock or burn it, still kind of in between which one it is. If you burn it, it'll be in an NFT, probably a revest NFT, for those of you who remember that. And that'll represent your power. That'll represent how much you've burned or locked. And that'll give you a boost on your infiniFi positions, such that you're making a higher rate of return on your locked positions than you would otherwise if you didn't hold that locked position. Or burned position. That allows us to get that same sort of positive feedback loop going, where the better we do as a protocol, the better our token does, and the more the more attention, vision, awareness we get leading to the protocol to continue growing, the token to continue growing well, the more vision. It's a really elegant cycle, and I am absolutely happy to take a leaf out of their book and rip it off.
Yeah. No, it's awesome to see some of these token models, these next gen token models coming to to market, right? Like I think, for example, Dolomite just did their TGE, and one of the things that they did, kind of similar to what Pendle did, except for like the more VE Dolo that you hold and the longer that it's locked for, you actually get a rebate on your borrow interest on Dolomite. So they're kind of creating it like, using it as a tool to create cheaper borrowing on the platform. So like things like that, right? Like I think you've got to really, the token space is so unique and so there's so much to build on that you can really do some fun, innovative things like that. And so like it almost creates, like I think for infiniFi, it almost creates kind of like this synthetic token floor almost, because like if you think about it, I could choose to burn X amount of infiniFi tokens, right, to boost my yield by whatever percentage that is. Or, it might be more beneficial in that moment in time for me to just add more dollars to my locked position. So it kind of like creates this. Am I thinking about that right? It kind of creates like this synthetic floor for the infiniFi token in theory, if you think about it that way.
It absolutely does. Because, there's really two ways to think about this. You have $1. You can either deposit that dollar to infiniFi and increase your position size and get a higher, say 10% APR on that dollar. Or you can take that dollar, buy InFi tokens, burn those InFi tokens. And by burning those InFi tokens, increase the rate of return on your existing position such that you're making effectively 10 cents more on that position, since you're already getting 10%. And the more TVL we have, the more aggressive that reflexive loop becomes, such that as TVL on infiniFi goes up, you get a bit of a soft floor formation where it's going to be a better decision below that price to always buy the InFi token and burn it versus just depositing more dollars to infiniFi. Which means that we actually have, it is a deflationary mechanism that is tied to the success of the system. It's kind of an anti-ohm mechanism. And I don't say that like ohm is bad. I'm saying the way that Olympus worked is they pushed tokens out. They had an inflationary mechanism that allowed them to capture value back into themselves. The protocol of liquidity that they got from bonding ohm. This is the opposite. This is a mechanism that actually allows us to capture the TVL and cause deflation with the TVL. The higher our TVL, the higher the deflation. Which actually means that if you combine those two mechanisms and eventually introduce a bonding mechanism a la Olympus, you can actually capture that soft floor as protocol-owned liquidity and directly kick that back into the protocol coffers, which is a really, really interesting feedback loop. I don't even know quite how to describe it. It probably shouldn't be possible, but it is possible. And I'm sure there's some limit in the math where this just stops being efficient. There's always limits to the math. No such thing as perpetual motion. But until we hit that limit, it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and like I said before, like it's just good to see, I think, some innovation happening with token design. Like, I think the last thing we need is like more governance tokens. We need, not that we don't need governance tokens, but we need tokens that have a little bit more utility than just governance, because as you can see with some of these DAOs out there, like, a lot of them are like shadow DAOs, right? Like they're really not governed, or like the distribution of the governing power is not distributed. Yeah, it's not decentralized, it's not distributed. So it kind of creates these perverse incentives that you're trying to avoid from the beginning, right? Is that you want the people with all of the money on the line to have the voting power, and not maybe like a governance token holder that has different priorities and different incentives than the people actually deploying the capital. So
that's why we have the people who are deposited deciding where their money goes. It's
I think it makes
much
sense.
better in alignment. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there that pretends to be decentralized, but is in no way, shape, or form. And honestly, the governance tokens are just, it's a meme. It's literally just memes.
Yeah.
People act like governance tokens are not meme tokens. Governance tokens are, by and large, memes. They're just meme coins.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, This has been good, Rob. It's a good place to wrap. I think we covered
Likewise,
a lot.
Kirk.
Hopefully if you're listening to this gives you some insights on how infiniFi works and maybe like what the opportunities are for you, and also what the risks are, which is, I think, an extremely important thing to think about, with any financial product. But really, thanks a lot, Rob. We really appreciate your time. Everybody check out the show notes. We'll have obviously links out to where you can find infiniFi. By the time this episode comes out, hopefully infiniFi is live. We'll have to see what that timing looks like and when infiniFi actually comes to market. But, definitely like and subscribe, if you enjoyed the conversation. And we will see you next time on the next episode of Proof of Vision. Thanks
for having me, Kirk. Great chatting with you all today.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.